welcome back to the We the Union podcast. I am your host, Daisha, and I want to thank you for stopping by and listening to this podcast. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different from the normal episodes. We're going to change things up a little bit. We are going to talk about women's history. As you should know, March is Women's History Month, and so we're going to talk about the extensive history of women in the labor movement. We all know that women have been putting in the work in the labor movement, in unions, getting things done. So please join me as I talk about this beautiful history of women in the labor movement. So we're going to take it back, all the way back to the 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution changed the face of the American workforce. During this time, women entered factories in large numbers, oftentimes working 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in dangerous jobs for low pay. In response to these terrible working conditions, young women, organized America's first industrial protests, strikes, and reform groups. During this time, one of the most common jobs for women was a domestic worker dealing with garments. It was a difficult field to work in, and women in this field typically worked 12 to 14 hours a day for low pay in very hot buildings, which of course led to the origination of the term sweatshop. We all know that term. This is kind of where it originated. Working conditions were often unsafe. Garment workers used boiling water, strong chemicals, hot irons, and it created this very, difficult, to say the least, working environment. So way back in the day, in the 1800s, a young woman by the name of Kate Mullaney worked as a laundress in New York. At 19 years old, when her father died, she began working and had to work 12 to 14 hours a day for only $3 a week. So, fed up with the low wages and the working conditions, she led a successful 6-day strike in 1864 with over 300 other women to increase wages and improve working conditions. The strike led to a 25% increase in wages. And in February 1864, with her co-workers, Esther Keegan and Sarah McKillen, Mullaney organized approximately 300 women into the first all-women union in the country, called the Collar Laundry Union. That is truly impressive for a 19-year-old, especially in 1864, because we all know what kind of society was back then, and a 19-year-old woman organizing a strike, that's truly impressive. So a few years later, a woman by the name of Mary Harris, aka Mother Jones, rose to prominence as a fearless organizer for the mine workers during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In 1871, Mary began to travel across the country. She moved from town to town in support of workers' struggles. She became known as Mother Jones to millions of working men and women across the country for her efforts on behalf of the miners. Mother Jones was so effective, the mine workers sent her into the coal fields to sign up miners with the union. Nearly anywhere coal miners, textile workers, or steel workers were fighting to organize a union, Mother Jones was there. So not only were women leading the charge as far as, creating unions and organizing, they were a huge supporting force to the men who worked in, steel mines, coal mines, and Mother Jones was one of those prominent women. In addition to miners, Mother Jones also was very concerned about child workers. During a silk strike in Philadelphia, 100,000 workers, including 16,000 children, left their jobs over a demand that their work week be cut from 60 to 55 hours. To attract attention to the cause of abolishing child labor, she led a children's march of 100 children from the textile mills of Philadelphia to New York City to show the New York millionaires their grievances. She led the children all the way to President Theodore Roosevelt's Long Island home. So she wasn't just working for the adults, she was also helping out the children, which is obviously, we know now today that it was an extremely terrible thing for children to be working in these coal mines, in these steel mines. So she led the charge to abolish child labor. So I'm sure a lot of people can appreciate that. So in the earlier 20th century is when things really began to pick up for women in the labor movement. In 1900, women in New York organized the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, aka ILGWU. In 1909, workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City walked out to protest the firing of union members. The walkout ignited frustration across the garment industry. Company brutality against picketers was met by a mass strike of 20,000 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women in the garment industry. An arbitrated settlement proved a partial victory for the ILGWU, but the 3-month strike, known as the Uprising of the 20,000, energized the union movement. So that, we're going to talk about the shirtwaist factory again in just a second. But you can see that a pattern was starting to develop with this company and the owners of this company, right? So on March 25th in 1911, one of the most infamous incidents in labor history occurred at the same factory where workers walked out just 2 years prior. On March 25th, a fire broke out at the factory, killing 146 workers. Now, I know you all, because I remember learning about this in history, so hopefully you guys learned about this as well, but I remember hearing about this and being like, wow, and just hearing the very horrific details of workers being stuck in an elevator, doors being locked so workers could not get out. They were stuck. A lot of people died literally at a door exit because it was locked and they couldn't get out. And a lot of workers jumped to their death. So very horrific fire and very horrific incident. This factory was a true sweatshop, employing young immigrant women who worked in a cramped space at lines of sewing machines. Nearly all the workers were teenage girls who worked 12 hours a day. The owners of this factory, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, were notorious anti-worker employers. Their employees were paid a mere $15 a week. And during the walkout in 1909, they hired police to imprison the striking women and paid off politicians to look the other way. However, the Triangle Shirtwaist fire did lead to massive policy changes that would help prevent another tragedy like this. And yeah, that's why it's probably one of the most infamous incidences, because it led to massive policy changes that, still protect us to this day. So the idea of women wage earners was changing as the percentage of married women in the workforce increased in the 1920s and then rose again by more than 25% in the 30s. Now, we all know what was happening during this time, especially in the 30s. There was the Great Depression, so work wasn't easy to come by in the first place, but it did not stop women from organizing and from leading labor movements. So during the 30s, we saw the emergence of Sue Ko Lee and Emma Tenayuka. Sue Ko Lee was a Chinese-American garment worker and labor organizer with the Chinese Ladies Garment Workers Association. In 1938, she participated in a successful 15-week strike against the National Dollar Store's garment factory. At the time, it was the longest strike in the history of San Francisco's Chinatown. And so with Emma Tenayuka was a Mexican-American labor organizer and civil rights activist. She led many strikes by women workers in Texas in the 1930s. Tenayuka led strikes, walkouts, and protests to respond to issues that particularly affected Mexican Americans.
Well, how did you get involved? Were you involved with the cigar strike?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had become very, very interested in the labor movement. I mean, first there were the anarquistas and so forth. And then you had also the influence of the CTM, Cooperación de Trabajadores de México. Do you mind if I smoke?
No,
Let me see
not
if
at
I
all.
have a
Not at
cigarette
all.
here yet. The salvation of all those who were hungry, and there were many. And what I saw here, it's only recently that I have been able to talk about some of the things that I saw here, I mean, as far as poverty, because it was just too difficult. So the cigar strikers were among the first. They were women. It's peculiar. It's the women, I mean, cops, women. It's the women who have led. And I just have a feeling, a very strong feeling, that if ever this world is civilized, it'll be more the work of women. I don't know how they're faring. I just read a review of a book, you see, about fatigue and the woman who has made it up to a vice president or something like that, making more than her husband, and that the fatigue, you see, is
Right.
coming home to children and so forth, taking, I mean,
The
it's
dual role.
the dual role. It's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't think that women will ever really be completely and totally free.
In 1938, Tenayuca led a huge strike by pecan shellers in San Antonio. At the time, pecan companies could get away with paying desperate workers just pennies for the dirty, difficult work. And we still see that problem today in the field, so we know. This changed on January 31st, 1938, when hundreds of pecan shellers walked off their jobs at the Delicious Pecan Company in protest of management's plan to lower wages even further. How do you lower wages from pennies? I don't know. But of course, management will try to find a way. We know that. These workers, mostly women, elected Tenayuca as their leader. The strike grew to include 12,000 workers and lasted for 3 months. San Antonio's mayor sent the police out with tear gas and clubs to break up picket lines and arrest strikers, but they did not back down. Eventually, this 3-month strike ended in a compromise. So now we're going to jump forward just a little bit to the mid-1950s, and you guys will know the name I'm about to say. I'm sure you will. So in the mid-1950s, we are introduced to one of the most prominent figures in the labor movement then and now. In 1955, Dolores Huerta launched her career in labor organizing by helping Fred Ross train organizers in Stockton, California. Then, in 1962, she founded United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez, another name I know you all know. In 1965, Huerta directed the UFW's national boycott during the Delano grape strike, which I'm sure we all have heard of.
14 years support has been highlighted by people who have joined us here today. Furthermore, these groups are committing themselves to help us until total victory is achieved. The developments of the past 7 months are only a slight indication of what is to come. The workers are on the rise. There will be strikes all over the state and throughout the country because Delano has shown what can be done, and the workers know that they are no longer alone. The agricultural workers are not going to remain static. The towns that have been reached by the pilgrimage will never be the same. On behalf of the National Farm Workers Association, its officers, and its members, on behalf of all of the farm workers of this state, we unconditionally demand that the governor of this state, Edmund Brown, call a special session of the legislature to enact a collective bargaining law for the farm workers of the state of California.
The boycott resulted in the entire California table grape industry signing a 3-year collective bargaining agreement with the United Farm Workers in 1970. Back then, and even to this day, Huerta has supported many labor-friendly legislation and continues to support farm workers and labor unions across the country. Now, this next woman that I'm going to mention, I did a post on her not too long ago on social media. Addie Wyatt. She is one of the country's foremost labor union leaders, women's rights activists, and civil rights activists. And we know that civil rights and labor rights overlap a lot, if not entirely. Addie began making her presence known throughout the labor movement in the 1940s. She was elected president in 1954 of Local 56 of the Packing House Workers, UPWA, which made her the first Black woman to hold a senior office in the U.S. labor movement. Amazing. That's an awesome accolade. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed her to his Commission on the Status of Women. She was a founding member of the National Organization of Women in 1963 and the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists in 1972. From 1956 to 1968, she joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in major civil rights marches, including the March on Washington, the March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and the demonstration in Chicago. In 1974, Wyatt was one of the founders of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, aka CLUW, C-L-U-W, the country's only national organization for union women. The purpose of CLUW is to unify all women in the labor movement and to determine and seek remedies to common problems and concerns to develop action programs. CLUW has inspired thousands of women to become more involved with their local unions.
Now, 3,200 trade unionists have come to Chicago, some by bus, some by train, and some by plane. And I think that has a message. You can tell them we didn't come here to swap recipes.
They did come to create a new organization, an organization recognizing union working women. The Coalition of Labor Union Women was founded in 1974 in Chicago, and 10 years later, more than 1,000 members returned to reflect on the past and plan for the future.
Much has been accomplished over the past 10 years. CLUW was and still is the leading voice for American working women. We have led in the struggle for quality child care in this country. We've led the struggle for pregnancy disability benefits. We have led the fight for comparable worth. We have led the fight for reproductive freedom, and we were a full participant in a leading organization in the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment.
This leading organization, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, boasts over 18,000 members, women and men, from 73 chapters in 32 states, representing 59 unions.
As I go around the country, young women will say to me that it's because of their activity in CLUW and participating in CLUW that they now attend their union meetings, that they now run for office in unions. I think that's one of the biggest accomplishments of CLUW over the 10 years, is the kind of training and self-confidence that women in the trade union movement have gotten.
I am the first vice president of my union, United Farm Workers. But what I've seen that CLUW has done, it's a vehicle where women know that it's okay. It's okay to go out and try to be the president of your union. And not only is it okay, but it's a responsibility to take leadership in your union, not only to organize within your own organization, but to help other women organize within your own organization and to organize, of course, the unorganized. But we do need women in leadership, and CLUW is saying to women, you should take that leadership.
And that is where I will end my history lesson, folks. And yes, I know there is a lot more that I can discuss and a lot more people that I can mention, like Velma Hopkins, Hattie Canty, and May Chin. But this is a fairly short podcast, and I couldn't possibly cover everything that needs to be mentioned. I do want to thank you all for listening and hopefully learning a little bit about, women's huge presence in the labor movement in the past and still today. They are still making changes and making strides in the labor movement. So thank you once again for listening, and I will see you all next time.